The Family Under the Bridge, Chapter 5. Armand scowled ferociously as he pushed his buggy along the river. He walked through another bridge tunnel. It was deep and inviting, and there were iron rings over which he could hang his things. But the Paris fireboats were moored along the quay. "Come a fire on the waterfront, and all of Paris will gather on my roof," he mumbled. So he plodded on to another bridge. He only stopped once to watch a man pull in his fishing line because he thought there was a big fish on the hook. But it was only a sodden shoe. "Ah, that's the way our hopes go, monsieur," Armand said sadly told the fisherman. Then he began jumping up and down with excitement. "The mate to the one in my buggy," he cried. "That's it!" The fisherman yanked the old shoe off the hook and tossed it to Armand. "Ooh la la, monsieur," said the hobo, "but that just goes to show you we should never give up hope." At last he found a bridge shelter that suited him. He spread his canvas as carefully as a family man laying the rug in a new house. "This isn't as cozy as the room that canary made for me," he admitted. "Funny how those black lines on the concrete kept out the draft." And he didn't sleep well that night. He kept wondering about the children. Were they warm enough? Wouldn't they be lonely? He tried to pretend to himself that he was fretting about something else. "It was my bridge," he said aloud. "They had no right to put me off my own property. I ought to go back and assert my rights." When he woke up the next morning, he noticed that a light snow had fallen during the night. He sat up and rubbed his eyes as he looked out at the quay. Paris had turned white overnight. It was a beautiful sight for those who could stand in a warm room and look through a window. What would the children do now? They'd probably play in it and get their death of cold with no grown-up to look after them. "I'll show them," growled Armand. "I'm going right back there and tell them what's what. I'd like to see them try to put me off my own property again." So back he trundled his buggy, and the wheels left wet black lines in the snow. There was no sign of life around the fireboats, but as he neared the old bridge tunnel, two women in fur coats came walking down the quay. In alarm, Armand noticed that the trail they were leaving behind them ended at the canvas propped against the wall. He quickened his shuffling steps. As the two women passed, they turned their heads towards him. "Poor wretched creature!" exclaimed the woman in the black fur coat. "Perhaps we could save him," said the woman in the brown fur coat. "Oh, go feed the pigeons," jeered Armand. His big footprints erased theirs in the melting snow. He pulled the canvas aside. The children were crying. "What's the matter?" asked Armand. "You still bawling because I left? You might have known I'd come back." Susie pulled Evelyn closer. "Two women were here talking to us," she sobbed. "They've gone to get somebody." "They're going to take us away and put us someplace," said Paul, wiping his eyes. "And they said they're going to put Mama in jail," Susie wept. "Oh, please help us, Monsieur Armand. Please don't stay mad at Mama." Armand kept twisting his beret around on his gray head. Now the soup was spilled into the fire. He knew women like those two in their fur coats, always trying to make hobos go to work or wash their faces or read books. And now they were picking on children. Must have run out of hobos. It really wasn't his affair, but Morelli had been right. These little ones. He pulled his beret down tightly. That was it. Morelli. "Start packing your loot in your cart," he ordered. "We've got to get out of here fast. Women like those two don't give up easy when they have a mind to save poor wretches." He helped the children gather together the few pans and fold the blankets. He pulled down the canvas and covered the cart with it. "But where will we go?" asked Susie. "Mama won't know where we are," cried Paul. "We can't leave Mama. She's the most of our family." "I'll come back and tell your Mama where you are," said Armand. "I've got just the right nest for you." He had to help them get their market cart up the steps. Then, because Evelyn's feet were so cold, he sat her in his buggy on top of his possessions. He pushed her down the street and across the bridge. Susie and Paul followed, pushing the cart. "If I were a big man," said Paul, "I wouldn't let those women be so bossy." "Where are we going?" asked Susie as they came to the Rue de Rivoli. "To Father Christmas to help us?" Armand looked back. "You don't need Father Christmas to help you," he said. "You've got me. Besides, he's too busy. It's only 4 days until Christmas." "Will you tell him we've left the bridge?" asked Susie anxiously, "just in case he does find a way to bring us a house." "Now don't you worry," said Armand. "Leave everything to me." Instead of leading them down the Rue de Rivoli, he waited for the automobiles to stop. He motioned the children to come alongside him with their pushcarts. They crossed the street abreast, and just as they reached the curb, a taxicab splashed them with dirty slush. But they kept on, single file again. Ahead of them loomed a giant shed. It was as big as a railroad station and as black and noisy. The Hales, Armand called back to them. That's the big central market where all the food comes into Paris. The children quickened their steps as the word food. I'm hungry, said Paul. Well, you needn't get hungry at the Hales, replied the hobo. They sell most of the stuff wholesale, but a fellow like me can sometimes wangle some food there. I'll try my luck. They saw the whole streets were covered by black sheds. Now they had to pick their way carefully. The sidewalks were cluttered with crates and baskets. The pavement was slimy with torn red, white, and blue papers. They kept bumping into things because they were so busy goggling at the sights. Boxes of fruit and vegetables made walls around them. There were long alleys with endless rows of beef, sheep, and hog carcasses hanging on hooks. Men went by carrying great baskets filled with hocks and pigs' feet and calves' heads. A man was lifting an immense box. He wore an outlandish hat, which made him look like a carnival figure. Who is he? Asked Susie, pointing. Why does he wear that funny hat? He's one of the strong ones, answered Armand. He's mighty proud of that hat because wearing it means he can carry 440 pounds at one time. Can you? Asked Paul. Armand shuddered. Oh, la la, I'll never know, he declared. They hurried past trucks back to the curb and lines of desks where buyers and sellers did their business. As they came out into the street behind the Hales, Armand met many old friends. Ragged men and women were picking through the old vegetables and fruits thrown into the gutter. Hello, Charlotte, he waved to a bleary-eyed man with his clothing held together by safety pins. Good morning, Marguerite, he greeted a woman dressed in men's clothes. Found any diamonds in the trash cans? Then he bumped into a six-wheeled metal cart pushed by a man with a tall hat and baggy pants. Well, if it isn't Louis, he exclaimed, making enough money to pay your rent in that mole tunnel off the Place Maubert? Louis grinned toothlessly. I can get you a job today, he offered. They need more pushers. They always do. Armand started away. I'm pushing, he said, and you can see I've got my own pushers with me. So long. The children hated to leave the Hales. They had enjoyed the noise and bustle. And with all that food, said Susie, wouldn't you think they could spare us just a little bit? They pushed their carts past St. Eustache Church and into a street teeming with other carts. It was as if the great market had spilled into the street in streams of fish and meat stands along both curbs. Paul stopped to look at the window of a coffee shop where colorful stuffed birds of South America were posed on open bags of coffee beans. The asphalt pavement ended when the Rue de Montorgueil became the Rue de Petit Carreau. Now they tramped over patterns of cobbles so tiny that they looked like mosaics. Armand stopped them when they came to a building with three black Egyptian heads trimming its front. He pointed to a narrow, winding alleyway. Part of the old Court of Miracles, he said. In the early days of Paris, all the beggars gathered back in there for shelter, and nobody dared bother them. He led them into the ancient alley with its dingy shops. Why did they call it the Court of Miracles? Asked Susie. Because it was like miracles the way those fake beggars shed their crutches and bandages when they came back here at night, explained Armand. Then they'd feast and make merry. Even had their own king they elected. The children looked disappointed to see the rear of a great garage and some more dark stores taking the place of the old court of the beggars. I bet you'd be the king if they'd still lived here, said Paul. Armand sighed. Ooh la la, those were the good old days, he said, as if he had lived in them himself and were remembering. They left the court with its rakish memories. They passed the doorways of dilapidated rooming houses. In each they could dimly see a battered old stairway, barely wide enough for a child, curving up to dark halls above, or perhaps a magic tower room. Who knew? Looking up at a high window across the street, they saw a queer old lady hanging out her washing on lines stretched across the window. and her washing was 6 long red pair of underpants and 6 long red gloves, as if she might have been the wife of Father Christmas. At last they came to an open corner fenced in by wooden boards. Above it rose the crags of buildings, which were slowly being torn down, floor by floor. Only the tall, jagged walls were left standing, like rocky mountain peaks. On some of them, one could trace the original rooms by the great squares of faded wallpaper. They could hear a clattering and banging behind the fence, as if the workmen were busy at their destruction. But when Armand guided them through an opening, the children's eyes opened wide. The sandy yard was filled with makeshift tents. 2 rattle-trapped automobiles were parked among them. Dark-skinned men gathered around a fire were beating on old pans with hammers. There were black-eyed women with gaudy skirts dragging over the wet sand. Children with half-wild fox faces stared at them. Then 5 dogs came bounding toward them, snarling and barking. Before they knew what had happened, Jojo sprang at the dogs. There was a flying, barking mass of fur and growls. Then a gypsy woman came running with a stick. She began beating the snarling dogs without playing favorites. They stopped fighting and howled in pain and fright. Armand grabbed Jojo and pulled him back. The gypsy woman dropped the stick and began talking to the dogs in a low, soft voice. They whined a little, then sniffed at Jojo in a friendly way, as if he had now been properly introduced. "Armand!" cried Morelli. "Welcome, old friend. You look as if you have come to stay for a while." She looked at the children. Paul and Susie were peeping fearfully around the tramp's back. "Welcome, little ones," she said. "You will not be lonely here. I will get you something to eat." She helped Evelyn down from the buggy. "We don't come empty-handed," said Armand. He began pulling things out of his buggy. First, a bunch of celery. Next, a couple of apples. Lastly, he proudly held up a dressed calf's head. He saw the little Calcette staring at the food as surprised as if he were a magician who had lifted it from a hat. "Don't know how that stuff dropped into my buggy," he said to them. "Especially with Evelyn on top. I must have brushed against something in the hails." The gypsy children closed in on the little Calcettes. The boys were coatless and wore patched pantaloons. The little girls were dressed in gaudy skirts that hung to the ground from under their torn coats. Their long black hair was cut in bangs over their beady eyes. But they thought the Calcettes were the odd-looking ones. They fingered Evelyn's red hair. They felt Susie's dark rough coat, then touched their own gay rags. "Your clothes look so sad," said a gypsy girl, "but you have happy hair." A gypsy man put down his hammer and greeted them as warmly as Morelli. "There is always room for 1 or 10 more in our camp," he said. "You can share the tent with Peep-Throw, Armand. He is in bed there now. He doesn't like the cold, so he sleeps all winter." "Can the girls live in the van with us?" cried a gypsy girl about Susie's age. Her clothes were the brightest of all she had worn and she wore golden rings in her ears, but her high shoes clumped like boots because they had no laces. "And you can live in our tent," a tall boy offered Paul. "It's near a bakery wall, so it's nice and warm." The gypsy girl took Susie by the hand. "My name is Tinka," she said. "What's yours?" "Tinka," replied Susie. "What a beautiful name. I'm Susie Calcette, and this is my brother Paul and my little sister Evelyn. We don't have a home anywhere." "I'll show you our home," Tinka offered. "I'll show Paul and Evelyn, too." She led the Calcettes through an alley of tents. In the far corner was Tinka's home. The red-headed Calcettes gasped at sight of it. It was a tiny house with a domed roof and carved brown doors and shutters. Instead of sitting on the ground, it was perched on wheels. "A gypsy house on wheels," said Paul. "Now that's the kind of home I'd like to have." "We can take our house anywhere we want," said Tinka proudly. "We just hook it up to the back of Uncle Nicky's automobile." Susie's eyes began to burn like blue flames. She squeezed Paul's arm. "Father Christmas's little donkey could bring us a house on wheels," she cried. "He could pull it." "Let's tell Monsieur Armand," said Paul. "Then he can tell Father Christmas what we've decided."